Our next speaker is Angela Miller from Washington University. Angela Miller is a professor of art history and American studies at Washington University in St. Louis, where she teaches cultural history of the arts in the 20th century United States. She is the lead author, along with Janet Berlo, we just heard, and Bryan Wolf and Jennifer Roberts of American Encounters, Art, History, and Cultural Identity. Also, currently, this year, she's down here in Washington, D.C. She's a William C. Seitz Senior Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery, just across the mall from us. She will speak to us. The title of her talk is Dancing on the Grave of History, the Chief Joseph Series. Angela. And we should be able just to advance. Oops. Yep.
Wow, that was, these are two very hard talks to follow. Thank you so much. And also for the wonderful, can everybody hear me? Is this okay? The wonderful talks in the first session. This has really been marvelous. I am so pleased and honored to be here today. So thank you to everyone who has been involved in organizing this. And also, what I'm going to talk about today has already been, I'm going to be reprising some themes that you've already, have already been very well framed and introduced in the talks that preceded me. But I want to offer a reading of the Chief Joseph series in some depth with great humility to do a more sustained reading of this single work. I want to begin with a quote by a Native artist and critic. Over the past 2 or 3 decades, the Native artist has been expected to be simultaneously the embodiment of tradition, spiritual seer, and all-purpose spokesperson for the not yet post-colonial high ground. Well, that's quite a burden to carry. The quote suggests that maybe Native artists shouldn't always have to enact or express their Native identities in their art, particularly when those identities are burdened by a history of Euro-American stereotypes, and we've heard about these today. Oh. I don't know, this is not. There we go. What is
the button on the right?
Yeah, that's what I was. Okay. So I just wanted to, sort of gesture towards the range of these stereotypes that I think Native artists have had to contend with as they address issues of Native identity. This is George DeForest Brush. The Native man as child of nature in this very beautiful but obviously very imagined or projected kind of image. The Native man stripped here of any kind of tribal or cultural or specificity to become a kind of generalized type. Navajo weavers were usually women, and they didn't weave in the nude. That was not that was not part of their culture. So this is clearly an excuse for the Native art, for the Euro-American artist to paint the nude. Frederick Remington, the type of the primitive savage, who represents a kind of regressive past of humanity. The Protest of the Sioux, this large monumental sculpture at the 1904 World's Fair, the defeated warrior who towers over the little man in the bowler hat, only to make his resistance appear all the more hopeless and ineffectual. Frederick Remington, again, a very prolific generator of stereotypes about Native people, the futility of those who cling to their ancestral ways and thus are barred from entering the world of the present. Let's not forget the show Indian, made famous by Buffalo Bill, and then probably the most damaging of these stereotypes, or the most harmful of all, which is the vanishing race, shown here in a very haunting image by Edward Curtis. So Kay WalkingStick, as a woman artist of Cherokee heritage, must have felt throughout her career in something of a double bind, having to manage two different sets of stereotyped identities with their respective expectations. I say this because a similar set of constricting notions surrounds and limits the Native artist who is also a woman. And again, I thank you for the papers for setting up this theme. To paint within either of these two identities as a woman and as a Native artist do indeed offer very rich expressive possibilities, but these identities, even as they are embraced by an artist like WalkingStick, also bring assumptions and preformed ideas that are not so easily controlled or managed. And the example of Georgia O'Keeffe comes very strongly to mind, another woman artist of note who also struggled with the inhibiting or limiting dimensions of her own desire to express a female identity. She chose to paint the landscape within her identity as a woman, as you see here, but that brought with it a number of problems that she struggled with in the early part of her career. She spent a lot of time struggling against the ways in which her male critics read her, their voyeuristic delight in glimpsing into the sexual experience of a woman that they believed O'Keeffe allowed them. And in this case, a female artist, Judy Chicago, who I feel had an equally reductive understanding of Georgia O'Keeffe in this place setting for this very famous series, The Dinner Party. Now, you have to admit that O'Keeffe herself gave these male critics a lot to work with in her own work. But painting one's identity as a woman, I'm going to get that off for now, and as an artist, painting as both a woman and as an artist of Native heritage, I think carried certain distinct challenges, and Kay WalkingStick did both at various times throughout her career. I want to turn now to the second of these challenges. How does one paint within a history of loss and dispossession without becoming oneself a victim or an object of that history? How does one retain one's individual voice as a creative actor while taking on a traumatic history that seems so much bigger than one's own power to speak? To answer these questions, I would ask us first to think about what historical episode Kay WalkingStick selected in order to commemorate with her art. Here is an image of the series overall. This Chief Joseph series centering upon a figure associated with a history of Native resistance to white governmental and military containment in the later 19th century. Joseph the Younger, I'll go back to that, was a Nez Perce Indian, son of the elder Joseph, who had converted to Christianity and advocated peaceful relations with white settlers. That didn't work very well for him or his people, especially after the US government expropriated millions of acres of tribal lands, forcing the Nez Perce onto a tiny reservation in Idaho. These actions produced growing resistance on the part of the Nez Perce. Joseph the Elder died. His father died in 1871, and Joseph took over. Threatened with forced removal, which is, of course, part of a much longer history of such actions. And I was calling to mind something that should have occurred to me earlier as I was thinking about this series, which is that in many ways this series about a forced migration in the later 19th century recalls the earlier forced migration, the Trail of Tears of the Cherokee people in the late 1830s, which of course has very direct and personal meaning to Kay WalkingStick as an artist of Cherokee heritage. So they were threatened with forced removal. Joseph the Younger reluctantly chose the path of resistance, leading his people on a 1,400-mile retreat, over the course of which the Nez Perce fended off a much greater U.S. military force, some 200 against 2,000, only surrendering after months of valorous fighting to preserve what was theirs. Go back to that for a minute. Let me just describe it a little bit. It was created over 3 years, as we've heard, at the height of the American Indian movement in the mid-1970s, and I think this is significant as a sort of background historical experience. It was WalkingStick's own tribute to pan-Indian movements of resistance and militancy against the U.S. government's ongoing suppression of their cultures and histories. And on a very different register, we might understand WalkingStick to be involved in a parallel kind of resistance as a late 20th century woman of Cherokee ancestry, an ancestry with which she had come to identify quite strongly. What then was the nature of her resistance? That's the question I want to ask. How do we read this series in the context of that broader set of movements and identity movements of the mid-1970s? How did she forge a resistance specifically through art? Many things, as we've already heard, the incredibly cosmopolitan and broad curiosities of Kay WalkingStick. Her career suggests that she was fully engaged, consciously self-cultivated. Remember that Georgia O'Keeffe, who was also a very self-cultivated artist, was compared to a tree whose work was sort of a kind of spontaneous outflowing of her feminine nature. So I want to emphasize the issue of a very careful, ambitious self-cultivation. And Kay refused to settle into any kind of signature style. Like any ambitious artist, she's carrying on conversations with a number of different traditions, as we know from this marvelous slide of her notebooks, some of which are in the exhibition. And here's a page from one of those, reaching from Morocco to in this case, the frescoes of the ancient world, to the late 20th century, and specifically in the series that I'm going to talk about, to minimalism. And in this art, we sense both the pleasures and the pressures of these multiple identities, all making their claims upon her as she developed, and what it meant to sort of contend with that pressure of those competing and multiple identities, which we all have, of course, we all have versions of that in our own lives, but I want to suggest that in her case, this must have had a specific kind of urgency. She wrote that, it is always important to me to be recognized as a Native person. It was also important to be understood as a New York artist, one who was working in the mainstream. She said that just very recently. As an ambitious young artist struggling to develop her own language, WalkingStick had to contend with a strong institutional and market tilt toward male artists. But at other times, her Native ancestry rose to particular urgency, and the mid-1970s was one such moment of personal urgency. So the Chief Joseph series consists of 36 panels in all, and only 30 are on view. 6 of the series have been dispersed to other collections. Each of the panels in this work is 20 inches by 15 inches, made of acrylic, ink, and her favored medium, saponified wax. They are installed upstairs as 3 lines of 10 panels, their horizontal expanse, suggesting both the scale of the West and also the sense of kind of monotonous plodding across this vast horizontal expanse over many months across the harsh, stark landscape of the upper Northwest. I'm going to now go through this series rather quickly. I'll be going back and forth. I hope that I don't distract you too much, but I want to give you a glimpse both of the overall series but also of the specific individual panels, and they're quite beautiful. I was really just so impressed with this series when I finally was able to see it last week. They're all Here, I'm going to go back to this, but these are the sketches, the very careful, meticulous plotting of this series in order to, as we'll see, to exhaust every possible arrangement of the 4 elements that comprise the work. They're all painted in a subdued palette. Some have black backgrounds, dark backgrounds. Some are dark gray. Some are lighter gray, kind of mottled gray backgrounds. One is red, one is a lighter, kind of very light gray. And onto this background, these shifting backgrounds of saponified wax with dissolved pigment, WalkingStick has painted every possible variation on the theme of these 2 sets of arced forms, one larger and one smaller, all in a contrasting color that clearly highlights them as figure against ground. The 2 different scales of the central arced forms introduce, therefore, a kind of dynamic element that works against the mute quality of the background of the panels overall. So we sense in the variations of these forms across these panels a kind of array of emotions. They really give us a different kind of, each one has a slightly different charge, a kind of emotional feel, which is also caused by the different underpainting that comes through as a result of her scraping and gouging the paint, the wax surface. So that we also sense not only a different kind of affective emotional charge, but also a kind of sense of shifting power relations that these 4 forms present in relation to one another. Oh, there's a lot. Yeah. These dark, severe shapes in Motherwell's Spanish elegy series, these shapes, I think, recall to me this series that Motherwell began in the late 40s, the elegies to the Spanish Republic, and continued as a series through the late 1960s. There's the same sense of a kind of compression, a kind of sense of history as a kind of compressive tension or pressure on the individual, the burden of history, which is very, very powerful in this series by Motherwell. There's a great one at the National Gallery here. And this is another series that also deals with the costs, the human and cultural costs of war. But at the same time, there's a difference, a considerable difference between Robert Motherwell's works and Kay WalkingStick's, because Kay, I think, really, there's a sense that the structures of history are compressive, they are a burden on the individual, but that there's a certain kind of freedom, and that's what I want to talk about now, is that sense of agency and freedom over the structural constraints of a traumatic past that I think she's dealing with here. There is beauty in WalkingStick's surfaces. They're elegantly modeled and layered with glimpses of red and blue and orange seeping through the geometric structure of the arcs. There are also, which you can't, the frames within frames, as you can see, that gray frame around there, a kind of matte gray border, which is almost like a picture frame, which sits atop the continuum of the design. And also there's very importantly, I think, these lines that extend across and cut through the frame in an interesting way and suggest continuity. So the series, in other words, really does suggest structure and variation. The same elements, repeated but in all possible combinations, allows us to see that history is governed by established structures, but that within these structures of power, there is agency, there is choice. Each time WalkingStick moves around the 4 elements that she has introduced, she in a sense, suggests another version of history. Each version carries its own universe of form and color. Each choice carries with it a shift in mood, so that we glimpse the possibility of freeing ourselves from the rigid structures of history, the possibility of reframing events that seem, as they happen, to be relentless and inexorable. The series allows us, for instance, to move fluidly between two planes, between upper and lower. These two planes that are suggested by these lines, where you have essentially the overlap of the arc form, suggests a kind of recessional space, upper and lower, but also near and far, up and down, figure and ground, containment and rupture. As the artist herself has said, it was all about expressing emotion and thought through these very simple means. I really wanted to be as simple as possible, very, very reduced. I wanted to take it all as far as I could and still have a painting that somehow said something. So the series also speaks to WalkingStick's choice to engage the art worlds of the 1970s through the language of minimalism. In minimalism, the artist chooses to submit herself to a specific logic of visual generation, the ways in which visual forms are generated. She chooses that logic, and then she accepts to work within its constraints. I think most directly here of somebody like Sol LeWitt, with his conceptual process of choosing a limited series of elements that he then uses to generate an endless variety of forms. Grappling with, she chooses this language of minimalism at a very charged moment in her own life, the death of her Cherokee father in 1974, and she's turning to history, choosing to work through a dialectic in which the dark weight of the past, the dark weight of history, not only personal with her father's death, but also the dispossession of Native people in the West, the way in which that weight of the past becomes the gateway into new forms, forms that have their own energy to generate other forms, forms that even in their expressive, deliberate expressive containment, have, in her words, the power, no, that's my words actually, have the power to create new possibilities. Forms that both submit to and struggle against the iron laws of history, forms that dance lightly on the grave of the past. Indeed, the artist's daughter, Erica WalkingStick Eccles Lowry, calls this series the exorcism of fate. Each arced form, laboriously painted onto the black inked ground, becomes a primal assertion of presence and endurance in the face of the muteness of the ground. The saponified wax medium adds to the labor and care with which the paintings were made. WalkingStick used screwdriver and razor blade to incise her shapes into the lines, into the canvas, a process that was also, that in a sense what that process does is to physically enact through a kind of ritualized and controlled gesture, the violence of the displacements, the history of displacement and removal. She herself noted that the action of incising conveys, in her words, conveys a certain anger. Incising into paint becomes a process that transforms paint from a representational medium into a medium of enactment. In such actions, one is not illustrating history, but making it. Finally, the careful application of the wax with a palette knife, along with a repetition of forms, rigorously worked out to exhaust all possible configurations, as I've explained, of these four shapes, that process seems to enact the patience and stolid fortitude required for the small band of Nez Perce to wage a war with the U.S. government. So to conclude, this is, I think, a very American story, this impulse to turn the on-the-ground realities of history toward the reinvention of the self and the reenactment of identity. The impulse brings with it not only freedom but responsibility. Who does one choose to identify with, and why and when? As I've argued, the various points in her artistic biography, at various points, different aspects of her identity took precedence over others. Her native ancestry, her experience as a woman, as a mother, as a lover, as someone who mourns, as an artist of ambition. She elected to explore different facets of this complex and layered sense of self at different times and through different languages. And in doing so, she asserted her own claims on that identity. The Chief Joseph series acknowledges the pressures of history, but does so in a language that preserves creative autonomy to choose one's imagery, one's mythic affinities, one's clan. Her art speaks to multiple inheritances without submitting to the singularity of one set of allegiances over all the others. Existence, lived experience, with its freight of memory and multiple identities, almost always wins out over essence in her work. The Anishinaabe author Gerald Visioner, and I thank Jessica Horton for this comment. Gerald Visioner advocates, in her words, for Native American survival through the creation of new stories, a practice that is itself rooted in tribal communities. So I want to end with a question, whether we might then see the Chief Joseph series as a form of storytelling that retakes agency over the shape of history. Thank you.